There's a lot of conspiracies about Israel that are in the ether, particularly online. One of those is...
So, they have kind of worked with the Israeli government to fund in cash Hamas in Gaza.
Is Qatar really a neutral place? Hamas have been able to siphon off billions of dollars and keep it safely in Qatar, and yet the American airbase is there. How do I make sense of this?
Okay, well, we got to go back and put a little context. After 9/11, we found out that, fast forward to October 7th, 2023, the first statements out of Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister were to praise October 7th as a kind of act of resistance. So of course they are not just neutral, but it gets more complicated.
What do we need to know about AIPAC? Who are AIPAC?
AIPAC are... It's not true that AIPAC always gets what it wants. In fact, the military-industrial complex is much more powerful than the Israel lobby. You're talking about the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
Yes,
records.
I am.
Well, it's only a slice of the pie.
Well, let's have the whole pie then.
Okay, so there's... And if that happens, people should go to jail.
Is there examples of money from these foreign lobbies going into the pockets of American politicians? Are you suggesting they've done that?
That is a very bad precedent.
Do you think America should be playing a role in these regional affairs?
Responsible to just pull the plug, to go 180 all at once, that is a recipe for chaos.
Mm-hmm. Before you hear from Eli Lake, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Eli Lake exploring the issues you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, Eli Lake. Eli, it is my great pleasure to speak with you. You're a veteran journalist, of course, at the Free Press, which is where our paths have crossed before. You're host of the Breaking History podcast at the Free Press, and you've written everywhere, I believe, from New York Post to Bloomberg and everywhere in between. I'm thrilled to speak with you here in DC. There's a lot to discuss, but the thing I was keen to talk about, because it's something that's been bothering me, is there's a lot of conspiracies about Israel that are in the ether, particularly online, and one of those has been about Israel's influence in America. And so I wanted to talk about AIPAC because it seems I just keep seeing AIPAC, and there's a lot of lies about it. Now, maybe we start there with AIPAC. What do we need to know about AIPAC? Who are AIPAC?
AIPAC are American citizens, primarily Jewish American citizens, and it does have a relationship with the sort of umbrella group of Jewish American organizations. But they're American citizens, and it is a very successful lobby that is more than, I think, 60 or 70 years old at this point. And it is a very effective lobby, primarily focused on Congress, that fights, I would say, specifically for the U.S.-Israel relationship. And significant, but is not the cause of the U.S.-Israel relationship. There are much bigger factors than simply the lobby of AIPAC, although it is very powerful and influential within Congress. But again, it's made up of American citizens in the same way that there were American citizens that have lobbied the Congress on both sides of the issue of Cuba. There have been American leftists who have argued, formed a committee called Hands Off Cuba in the early 1960s. There are exiles of Cuba who hate Fidel Castro that have pushed for a much harder line. You can go through the list. America is a country with lots and lots of people, and they have the right to petition their government. And American citizens, this is a big part of the process. And AIPAC really is a manifestation of that. The only thing I would say about AIPAC is it's not true that AIPAC always gets what it wants. In fact, recently you could argue that AIPAC has not had the best track record. AIPAC opposed Barack Obama's 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, as did the government of Israel. That went through. Members of Congress who AIPAC members had raised money for. It's a technical distinction, but AIPAC itself does not give directly to congressional candidates. But, you could say the pro-Israel lobby as a sort of stand-in gave lots of money to Democrats who ended up voting for the Iran nuclear deal over the wishes of AIPAC, and they lost that huge, important policy fight. AIPAC's influence, was like you could argue limited when the Biden administration began to criticize Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. it's one factor. It's not the only factor. And the problem with a lot of the kind of recent takes that try to explain everything through the prism of AIPAC is that it doesn't look at a lot of other things that are also extremely important. For example, let's look at the foreign aid. Israel's the largest recipient of foreign aid. Personally, I'm a very pro-Israel person, but I think, Israel should graduate from aid to something else, but that's another story.
I got the figure of $310 to $317 billion
That's right. But
since 1945. This is 47.
Right, but yes, and I should say that it really starts up after the Camp David Accords, which is to say that there was sporadic money that the U.S. gave to Israel, but it wasn't until the great peace between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin that you then saw it as a part of the treaty, I should say, between Israel and Egypt. There was a factor that sort of committed the U.S. to fund both Israel and Egypt for the foreseeable future. So that's the beginning of the formalized relationship. And Israel has certainly gotten a lot of military aid from the United States. But the nature of that aid is also a subsidy for American defense contractors and America's defense industry. So there's a reason why it's not just, you could argue AIPAC is pushing on an open door because a lot of defense contractors, people who make weapons, that's part of their business plan, is that they know that there's going to be a certain kind of subsidy and there's going to be a certain amount of reserve of foreign cash that will be there for the weapons and the planes, the fighter jets and tanks and various things that they make. So that comes back in a weird way into the U.S. economy.
Yeah, okay, but that wouldn't necessarily persuade any of us who are sort of skeptical about the military-industrial complex.
Oh, sure, but what I'm saying is the military-industrial complex is much more powerful than the Israel lobby.
A quick interruption from our sponsor. Using Ground News, let's take a quick look at how the media is reporting on Trump's first 100 days back in office. Left-leaning El País ran the headline, "Trump completes 100 days of revenge and consummated threats." Now let's use Ground News to see how the rest of the media is covering this story. We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website allow me and my team to quickly see through media bias and get the full picture on any news story. There are multiple articles published on Trump's first 100 days, and we can access every single one on Ground News with context on each source. Interestingly, only 15% of left-leaning outlets are covering this story. Meanwhile, right-leaning Daily Wire ran the headline, "Just Getting Started. Trump vows more action in 100 days of greatness rally." A very different narrative from El País. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential for making informed decisions and spotting bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. And I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, and by supporting my sponsors, you are supporting this show. Thank you, and back to the interview.
My point is not making one about, my point is only to simply say, if you only focus on the Israel lobby, or the pro-Israel lobby, and you don't look at the wider defense industrial complex, then you're really missing the forest for the trees.
I mean, wouldn't you, if you want to make a better case, I should just say another thing. I don't like lobbying. I don't like it when it's Big Pharma. I don't like it when it's the NRA.
Yeah.
I don't like it when it's individual countries. And in this conversation, we'll go into the other nations who are outspending Israel on lobbying. AIPAC is not Israel, as we've noted, but Israel does also spend money on lobbying in DC. But I don't like lobbying, generally speaking. So this, I would never want to defend that. More, I want to examine the nature of it and what is true and what is not true. Now, it seems to me that a better argument, if you were going to make an argument in favor of lobbying for Israel, would be, firstly, well, you should set out what exactly America gets in return, right? And it gets intelligence. That's presumably
more than intelligence. I mean, Israel is an incredibly innovative defense tech hub. So the remarkable technology, which involves a sort of instant calculation of algorithms about what missiles to strike down, knowing where they're going to probably land, whether it's a populated area or not, which is the technology that makes Iron Dome so effective. That's developed by Israel. Now, it was a joint project with an American defense contractor, but it is Israeli technology. Israel is one of the world leaders when it comes to cybersecurity, for example. And this has enormous benefits because, at least the old concept of having an arsenal of democracy that it's not just America, but America's other allies that get the benefits of this advanced technology. And that's a huge thing. So that's the first sort of bucket. The second is what you said, which is intelligence, which is that Israel has extraordinary human intelligence, as was proven in Iran. It was able to get to Ismail Haniyeh in a guest house in the capital. That takes enormous networks of human intelligence, which Israel has. And America, somebody who's covered the CIA and the national security state for some years, doesn't have when it comes to Iran or places like Lebanon. So that's important as well. And finally, I would just say that Israel now is the centerpiece of a pro-American alliance network in the Middle East. There's really two sides right now in terms of a sort of larger picture in the Middle East. There's Iran, its proxy militias like the Houthis in Yemen, what's left of Hezbollah, Hamas. And one could argue Qatar is a Janus-faced ally of the United States, but it's also has, a foot in the Iranian axis. And then there's Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Jordan, Israel. And that's pretty much like the future of how things are going. So Israel's the anchor of that. Israel's the most powerful state, the wealthiest state, and it's got the best military technology. So, that's another kind of reason that has nothing to do with what lobbyists say on Capitol Hill, if that makes sense. That's self-evident. So that's the other thing.
And I guess an argument against that would be from the America First law, which is a big part of MAGA. I wouldn't say all of MAGA, but
no, I don't think it's all of MAGA.
They would say we don't want anything to do with any foreign powers. We shouldn't be giving any money. We want to pull out. I mean, do you think what's the I don't know where you stand on this, but do you think America should be playing a role in these regional affairs?
I think America is right now a great superpower. And I understand to a point, the argument of not being concerned with, I don't know, how many women are in the Afghan National Assembly or something, right? There's a limit to you can be super engaged or you can sort of have, but, the United States is a really powerful country and there are a lot of benefits to America being a superpower. One of them is reliable international trade, which I still think is a good thing. Although I'm now very open to the argument that there are lots of people in America who were part of our industrial economy who were left behind, and that's kind of happened over the course of 2 generations. And we should do something to fix that. Mm-hmm. I don't think the way we fix that is to say we're no longer going to be a global power. We are a global power. So that's a separate argument. But getting back to AIPAC,
yeah.
The reason why America is a global power is not because of the influence of a lobby of largely American Jews and also evangelicals who support the U.S.-Israel relationship. That is not the reason why. The reason why are these deeper and structural things, whether it's the military-industrial complex, whether it's the alliance structure of the United States that's been there for a very long time. These are things that are much more important in determining why America is at its policy position than the implication of those who criticize AIPAC and the pro-Israel lobby, which is that there is a kind of distortion of the U.S. national interest. Mm-hmm. I don't think that that's true at all. I think that's a complete misreading of why the United States makes these decisions, and it's a misreading of how the world works in many ways. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing, just to make it clear analytically, this argument is bananas and not true, okay? Yeah. And the second point is what you're asking, is it a good thing? Is it a good thing for America to be engaged in the world? Well, let's just, my view is it is, but let's say you disagree. How do you deal with that? So I think the responsible thing is if you don't want America to be as engaged in the world, you don't think America should be defending Europe, you don't think America should have a role in the Middle East, I might disagree with you, but is it responsible to just pull the plug to go 180 all at once? That is a recipe for chaos. Mm-hmm. And historically, at least, if you have America sort of just turning an about face that suddenly, then you're kind of reaping the whirlwind. Who's going to fill the void? It's not like everything's going to be fine now that America's gone. That's fantasy. Mm-hmm. So you have to plan that sort of thing. If you think America should disengage, that's a valid position, but show me a responsible way to do that. Now, there is a responsible way, and I would argue that J.D. Vance laid it out in a speech nearly a year ago at the Quincy Institute. What he talked about is the idea that Israel's a maturing power. It could replace America's role as a kind of regional big dog, if you will, to kind of keep the peace, to deal with things like pirates off the coast of Somalia one day, or, keeping the, Straits of Tiran open or the Suez Canal open for international trade. Well, that's an argument, you know what I'm saying, where America could still benefit, but maybe not have to pay as much of the bill. But that, again, that's an argument for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, right? I mean, you know what I'm saying? That's not really, so show me the plan. Okay, if you don't think America should be there, I'm going to maybe disagree, but okay, show me the plan.
Yeah.
But again, getting back to this argument that it's because of this lobby that the United States is entangled in all this, it's just nonsense. It's just not true.
Yeah.
And it wasn't true, by the way, for the Iraq War, which is where a lot of this stuff kind of started in the current generation. Although,
what do you mean the Iraq War? What?
Well, I'm saying in the second Iraq War in 2003, Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer first wrote a paper, and then they wrote a book called The Israel Lobby.
Right.
And the original paper, although the book then backs away from this thesis, says that it's the broader pro-Israel lobby as to why the United States went to war in Iraq. And I'd say, no, that's hogwash. That the reason why America went to war in Iraq is there was an unsatisfactory ceasefire after the first Gulf War. There was not even Democratic and Republican administrations, Clinton and George W. Bush, didn't believe that Saddam Hussein had fully disarmed. They couldn't get a clean bill of health, even from the United Nations weapons inspectors. I mean, there's a series of reasons. There were a lot of Iraqis who were driven out of Saddam Hussein's Iraq. They were middle-class people. They were professionals. They had degrees. They went to America. They went to Europe, and they went on television. They told lots of people about, how terrible it was living under this sort of tyranny. There's a whole series of factors, and it really wasn't a huge priority at the time, having covered this. I remember I was a younger reporter back then. It wasn't the number one priority at the time for AIPAC. AIPAC was concerned about the Second Intifada, which was very much, this was the collapse of the Oslo peace process, and it was concerned about Iran. If you wanted to go to war with Iraq, that is something that lots of people who were concerned about Iran were worried that taking out Saddam Hussein would strengthen Iran, which, by the way, it did.
Wait, so, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I haven't read Mearsheimer's book.
Yeah.
So you're saying that AIPAC did have an influence?
No. I'm saying AIPAC. I'm saying that I think it was wrong. They originally said that it was because of the pro-Israel lobby that
Mearsheimer argued.
Yes, this is Mearsheimer and Walt. They argued in their book or their paper originally, and then they kind of expanded it to a book that backed away from the most fallacious part of that argument. But this then became a sort of line 20 years ago in the States.
And what exactly was the argument?
The argument was that had it not been for the pro-Israel lobby, the United States would not have invaded Iraq the second time in 2003.
But they backed away from that argument later.
They didn't say it as explicitly as they did in an initial paper that they wrote for the London Review of Books.
Right. Okay.
So the initial paper was out and out sort of saying these things that wasn't exactly right. They got a book contract out of it. They wrote the book. And in the book, they sort of backed away a little bit from this.
Huh.
But my point here is that the whole thing is kind of crazy because there's the reason why the United States went to war in Iraq in 2003, and by the way, it was voted on, there was a resolution calling for this use of force. It was all because there had been, I think it was 14 or 15 UN Security Council resolutions because Saddam, as a condition of the ceasefire way back in 1991, had to disarm. And that was the reason that was stated by Colin Powell. And as I said, there are all these other sorts of factors. America was in a different place. This was still, you could say, the West was high off of the Cold War victory. There were a lot of people at the time who said, oh, we're the only superpower. Mm-hmm. We have no rivals. We can do this. And, Saddam Hussein needs to disarm. This is after 9/11. There's a concern about terrorism. There's all kinds of things that are independent of the pro-Israel lobby. Mm-hmm. But I'm saying this is an example of the kind of reasoning that is often invoked when it comes to focusing just on AIPAC. It becomes like a kind of buzzword that unlocks a conspiracy.
It's such a buzzword, AIPAC. I wonder if we just drill a little bit down into it. What do you know about its founding?
Well, originally, I think it was mandated by something called the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. You're catching me. I'm kind of going on memory here, so I want to make sure that I'm getting it right. But it was essentially a way for the Jewish community at first to represent what was the majority opinion in, I think it's the early 1960s of, so there would be a voice in Congress to support things like aid to Israel. I mean, there really wasn't this kind of mature U.S.-Israel relationship until the Camp David Accords, as I think I mentioned earlier. So it wasn't this major group. I mean, and also you got to remember, U.S. is selling U.S. also has a long-standing relationship with Saudi Arabia, and in this period, Saudi Arabia and Israel were on polar opposite sides. So sometimes, like AIPAC, I think in the 1980s, for example, would have a lobbying campaign against selling, advanced aircraft to Saudi Arabia. So that would be another example of kind of what they would do.
As far as I've looked into it, apart from the founding, I can't find anything more than circumstantial evidence that there was any Israelis involved in AIPAC, that it is, as you say, Jewish Americans.
Yeah.
And that seems to be something that every single one of these anti-AIPAC, to be fair, what I've seen of John Mersheimer, he is more delicate and careful with his language.
Yeah.
But these other more reactionary types, so they seem to avoid that. Now, you mentioned Saudi Arabia. They, up there with the Emiratis, are the biggest donors since 2016. In recent years, up to $100 million in official donations, lobbying donations.
You're talking about the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
Yes,
records.
I am. So AIPAC
that's
is
only,
out.
I have to
AIPAC
tell
is
you,
out.
that's only a slice of the pie.
Well, let's have the whole pie then.
Okay, so there's official stuff, which is that you have to register as a foreign agent if you formally represent a foreign country. That's one slice of the pie. And I believe that there is actual foreign agents on behalf of Israel. Israel also, every country has this kind of arrangement. But there's a lot of other ways to purchase influence in the United States that allows you to get around the Foreign Agents Registration Act. For example, if you just simply decide that you're going to give money to, think tanks, universities, that is not considered direct lobbying. There's a lot of money, especially from Qatar, as I've written about. I think it's about $2 billion over like this 20-year period that went into lots of American universities. They built a kind of education city in Doha, Qatar that were affiliated with some of the most prestigious American universities. So that's an example of how you can kind of have influence in the broader discourse without necessarily having somebody who says, "Hi, my name's John Smith and I represent the nation of Saudi Arabia," or something like that. So that's one thing. The other thing is there's, just doing, like, if you are a very wealthy country and you decide that you're going to have the best law firms in Washington on retainer, that is itself kind of influence, even if those people are not lobbying for a particular policy. What you're doing by having the best lawyers when it comes to certain areas, like on retainer, is you're denying it for your people who would argue against your foreign policy. Same with PR firms. So there is a lot of different ways in which you can influence things.
Okay, so if we're to
that are not covered by the Foreign Agents Registration Act, at least historically.
Let's just color this in a little bit, people. Foreign Agents Registration Act that came in 1938, and that all foreign nations that have a lobbying group in DC need to register through FARA. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, that was originally to deal with the American Bund who were representing the Nazis.
Say that again.
The American Bund who was representing the Nazis. So you had, especially in Long Island, oddly, you had in the 30s some Americans. And the Nazis themselves were trying to kind of cultivate this, that were trying to influence the American debate on behalf of the Third Reich. This is before World War II starts. This is really before America kind of really gets involved.
Okay, I see. Okay, so then you have...
Then it was turned against the communists after 1945, for the most part.
Or the Soviets specifically, or just all communist nations?
Well, the Soviets specifically. It was kind of like turned as like, we're going to try to, if the Soviets are trying to influence foreign policy. And then for a very long time, I have to tell you, since the early 60s, the Foreign Agents Registration Act office at the Justice Department was a backwater. It didn't prosecute anybody. It was just not something that was done. And over time, there was another law called the Lobbying Disclosure Act, that was passed, I think, in the 1990s or maybe the 2000s. I have to check. But what that allowed was that if you represented say, a foreign think tank or a foreign business. And really what you were doing was you were just making an argument, say, for the government of Turkey, but you technically were being hired out by, this company that, was close to the Erdogan or something like that. Then you didn't have to go through all of the disclosure requirements for the stringent Foreign Agents Registration Act. You could file under what's known as the Lobbying Disclosure Act. And that was for like 20 years, that was sort of, lots of people were told that they could do that. This is what, by the way, if you want to know how, to bring up a blast from the past, Paul Manafort and other people in Washington, including the Mercury Communications, and I have to remember the other one, Tony Podesta's brother, represented the Yanukovych government in Ukraine for about 10 years. Well, they never actually represented the government of Ukraine under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. What they did is they represented a think tank, I think it was called the Center for like a Modern European Integration, something like that. That was then funded by Yanukovych's party, known as the Party of Regents. And they didn't have to register as a foreign lobbyist. They just said, oh, we're representing that. But they were basically pro-Ukraine lobbyists at the time. So that you were able to get around the Foreign Agents Registration Act this way for a while. And then Trump is elected the first time. And one specific guy who admits this in his memoir, named Andrew Weissman, you may have seen him on MSNBC. He was a deputy to the Mueller investigation. And what he did is he decided he was going to roll up a lot of people working for Trump and pressure them by threatening to enforce Foreign Agents Registration Act in a way that it hadn't been enforced for nearly half a century.
I don't understand this enforcing thing, and you mentioned they didn't prosecute anyone, but what exactly is the act? Because if it's just that you have to register what lobbying you're doing.
If I catch you, and you are lobbying for, I don't know, Albania, okay? Now, I could
Britain.
Okay, fair enough. If you're lobbying for the UK, right? Okay.
Accent.
If you're lobbying for the UK. Okay, and I figure out that, no, you're being paid by someone to lobby for the United Kingdom. In theory, I could prosecute you in a court of law, and I could, potentially send you to jail for a long time. But what happened in reality, when I say it wasn't really enforced, is that the punishment would be, if you were found to be out of compliance, that you just simply had to back register, and occasionally you would get a fine. But when you're talking about the amounts of money that you get for representing a foreign nation in Washington, the fines were negligible. So It was basically like there wasn't real enforcement, even though on the books you could, but there was something called, there were basically enforcement guidelines from the Justice Department that hadn't changed between administrations, as I said, for nearly 50 years. I think it's like over 50 years, there maybe been 4 people who were actually prosecuted under the law. And there were a lot more cases that they could have done. And so what Andrew Weissman did is he went to the FARA office when he was hired by Mueller to come back in. He was formerly chief of staff of the FBI, kind of a big guy in especially Democratic circles. And he decided, okay, I'm going to use this in a new way. I'm going to enforce it to the maximum extent. And he started rolling up largely people who supported Trump, people like Mike Flynn, and so forth. And I always thought that this was dirty pool because he was creating a new enforcement standard. Normally, when the Justice Department, what they have to do is they put an announcement. We're now going to enforce the law this way. All the lawyers who work on FARA, as it's known, they tell their clients, okay, no more Lobbying Disclosure Act. That loophole doesn't work anymore. We got to do it this way. And, there's a time of adjustment. And so that's the kind of fair, honest, above board way to do it. What Andrew Weissman decided to do is he went sort of, nope, I'm going to use this standard for stuff that happened before, and we're going to do it to pressure people the way you would roll up witnesses in an investigation of a mob boss or something like that. Okay. So then all this stuff kind of comes back in the news. This is the end of the 2010s, if you will, right? And there are a couple Democrats who get caught up, but they beat the case. And by the way, judges throw a lot of this stuff out because this is a new interpretation. And now what we're seeing is that we're back to an environment where the government is enforcing the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They've gone after unregistered Iranian agents. They've gone after all kinds of people. But that was, as I said before, just because I've written a lot about this, that was in large part because of the Mueller investigation and Trump. That's what changed it.
See, okay. So if one is to zoom out one moment, how are you in favor of the foreign nations being allowed to lobby in DC?
I'm in favor of the disclosure requirements of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is to say,
as long as they disclose,
you have to disclose. And I think that it was abused before. So I think that people were able to get around it with these little things that I was describing earlier.
And
right?
so why is it a good thing that foreign nations can lobby here?
Because I sort of almost see it as a kind of a free speech argument, right? People elect politicians to Congress, lobbyists get to make their case. And my view is that oftentimes on an issue, there's enough of, you know what I'm saying? I mean, let me put it like this. There's an India lobby and there's a Pakistan lobby. And my view is that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee should hear both sides, if that makes sense. That, if you want to make...
But they should hear both sides, and why should they be paid for hearing both sides? Like,
well, no. The lobbyism, I'm in favor of lobbyists not paying off politicians. I'm not in favor of that. I'm talking about specifically the way that lobbying is defined in the Foreign Agents Registration Act is that if you're paid by a foreign government and you write op-eds and you talk to congressmen and you just simply use your speech to advocate, that's fine. What I think is illegal and should remain illegal is that foreign governments should not be able to fund domestic campaigns. And if that happens, people should go to jail.
Domestic campaigns or any domestic politicians.
Yeah, but back to AIPAC. AIPAC itself works as just sort of making the argument before Congress. And then there are other American citizens, of course, that raise money that they're very open about. Like, I think I forget some of these names, but anyway, these are kind of other groups that would just say, all right, well, we want to support, as American citizens, candidates who want a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, in the same way that there's some Americans who say we want to support Americans who want to reform our healthcare system, or we want to support Americans who respect the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
That's all well and good.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure there's no foreign money involved. It gets to kind of a toxic area when Jewish Americans, who have every right to take advantage of the full flower of American citizenship and all the rights that come along with it, they can petition their government, they can support candidates who they like, and they can give money to candidates who they like, and that's all well and good. Then to conflate that because they're Jewish to say, oh, that's the same as Israel. That's not the same thing. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So, and just as, I don't know, like Korean Americans can support candidates who they, and give money to candidates who they will have a stronger relationship with South Korea. Mm-hmm. That's just how it is. We live in a big, diverse country with all kinds of people who have different ethnic backgrounds.
Is there examples of money from these foreign lobbies going into the pockets of American politicians?
Oh, I'm sure there is. I mean, there have been scandals to that extent. I mean, we're seeing
that's illegal, though.
That is illegal. Like, look at Senator Menendez. He's a Democrat from New Jersey. I believe he was convicted. Yes, he was convicted for taking money effectively from Egypt. And I don't want to get it wrong. I think it was Egypt and Turkey, but I could be wrong. Turkey is also Eric Adams. So there's yes, if the FBI finds that an American politician is getting money from a foreign government or a foreign interest, that's totally different kettle of fish.
Is that what Eric Adams got done on? Mayor?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't exactly, he wasn't getting money.
He was getting plane tickets,
wasn't he? Was getting like first class plane tickets and things like that. Yes, but they were basically like gifts.
And he was charged under FARA?
No, he was not charged under FARA. I believe he was charged under anti-corruption, I'm pretty sure.
Anti-corruption?
Yeah.
Okay. So if I can paint a picture then of lobbying, yeah. I've kind of hinted at that as far as I can work out that the countries under FARA,
yes,
who spent the most on lobbying in DC, the Saudis for 100 million since the last few years, the Emiratis, 100 million since 2016, the Qataris, you, of course, breaking the big story on Qatari influence in America, which we will tuck right into in a moment. Japan has spent over 100 million since 2016. Mm-hmm. China has spent 418 million since 2016.
Think about China. But see, I just would say the data that you're getting from the Foreign Agents Registration Act is only a slice of the picture.
Right.
That is how much money you pay for the lobbying firms in Washington, and they have to register themselves as agents of that power. That is one part of it, but it's not the only part of it.
Right.
With China, you could argue that, the incredibly powerful social media tool of TikTok is a form of influencing American public opinion because they can turn up the dials about like what, videos people see. So that's an example. And then if you want to talk about the Qatari stuff and the amount of money they pour into universities, that's another example. Whereas, okay, it's not like you're paying money for a guy in a 3-piece suit to go and knock on a congressman's door, but you're influencing maybe the parameters of the debate in the Middle East Studies program at the best universities in the country. Or you are, kind of building relationships.
Which they've done. Are you suggesting they've done that?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated. And we should say that the reasons why American universities have been so, in my view, very much slanted against Israel and the Israel-Palestinian conflict is not entirely explained because of foreign money by any stretch. I think it's much more explained by the influence of ideology, and specifically the late Professor Edward Said, which is what my next podcast is about, which I think when this comes out, it'll be the current podcast.
He wrote Orientalism?
Correct.
In 1960?
78.
78.
Yes.
Okay. And so this is, now my memory of him is that or maybe you should color this in, or take the ball from my hands.
No.
Is that it was kind of a post that neo-Marxist, but changing this into the paradigm of the oppressed and the oppressors on the sort of geopolitical.
Yeah, that's generally right. He was specifically attacking a school of thought known as the Orientalists, which were mainly historians, but also people who just looked at the kind of etymology of words, philologists. And he also looked at novelists from Europe. He looked at artists from Europe, and he made an argument that the portrayal of the exotic East, and specifically Arabs and Muslims, was a function of the European domination of the region, so that you couldn't separate out the policies of the East India Company from the histories that British historians would write about places like India or Canton, or in his case, Arabia. So this was at the time considered a very powerful and radical critique. I think it's deeply flawed. I think he largely argues by anecdote and example, and by just sort of listing, he doesn't do a systematic analysis. He cherry picks from the historians that he's going after, specifically someone named Bernard Lewis, who was his great rival. And in the process, this caught like wildfire in the academy. But basically what it meant is that you have to hire Palestinians to teach about Palestinian history. You have to hire Arabs to teach about Arab history. You have to hire Muslims to talk about Islam. And that's fair. That was
his.
That was sort of the effect of it in a way. Let these people tell their own stories. And it really did fit very much in the tenor of the times. But what he was unprepared for was he was so focused on critiquing, say, the discourse about how the West understands Islam and the stereotypes of it, that when you saw the Islamic Revolution in Iran, he was caught completely flat-footed. He could not explain the rise of Islamic fundamentalism or political Islam, and how it was able to take a country that admittedly, Shah was a despot, but it was a despot that allowed for fairly kind of Western system, albeit unfair, where you could drink alcohol, women could work as lawyers and so forth, and then completely turn that into a kind of Islamic theocracy. And what he would argue, and he did argue in a subsequent book called Covering Islam, was that the coverage of the 1979 revolution was a product of these racist stereotypes that the West has. And he completely failed to understand the menace of Ayatollah Khomeini, as did many leftists, including somebody who very influential for him, Michel Foucault, who was this postmodern thinker who said there's no such thing really as objective truth. The only thing you have is your narratives, and everything that you think you know is really a reflection of power. So Michel Foucault doesn't, and Said, to his credit, doesn't go as far as Michel Foucault is, praising the Islamic Revolution, saying what a wonderful expression of freedom it is, and he couldn't have been more wrong. Obviously, this Iran has been terrible. Has been, first of all the other leftists were the first people to go, but second of all, look at the history of Iran. Okay, and so this is the sort of legacy of Said, but Said was, Columbia's ground zero, but really all of the elite universities in America and also Europe began to reflect, this new approach. So what you didn't see were these kind of much more objective.
Straight away, or is it a gradual thing over?
I would say it took a sort of, you had to see this sort of generation of the older guard die out in a way, because universities, you get tenure and you can't fire them. But eventually, yes, if you want to look at like who's teaching today at Columbia about the Middle East, it's all people who are kind of the sons and daughters of Said, if you will.
I see. Okay. So tell me exactly why Said, link me Said with, let's say, what's going on at Columbia University, Gaza Plaza, the Tentifada. Yeah. Paint that part of the picture for me.
Well, first of all, Said is an activist intellectual. Now, he wasn't the first activist intellectual, but he's an activist intellectual. What I mean by that is that he was not satisfied just doing comparative literature and textual analysis. He wrote speeches for Yasser Arafat. He became very much involved in the cause of Palestinian freedom, as he would call it. He was a member of the Palestinian National Assembly, which is sort of like the PLO's legislature in exile. So that's the first thing. And so the idea that scholars cannot be neutral, they have to take a side, and the oppressed peoples, the wretched of the earth in this case, are going to be the Palestinians. Well, that kind of politics took over not just Middle East studies. I mean, like you could say that Said is responsible for the proliferation of what might be known as post-colonial studies. So that is that you can see a direct line there, which is, and then also the students get the headlines, but really, if you look at the dynamics in a lot of these places, but particularly true in Columbia, it's the faculty that are advocating for them behind the scenes. The faculty in a lot of these cases formed kind of barricades around the encampments at first to try to protect these students who were taking over quads from being disrupted by campus security. So it's that relationship, I would say, that's really the germ of that starts with Said.
Yeah, so what I noticed is that there's a kind of, it's the goody-baddie fallacy.
Yeah.
It's the oppressor oppressed, and the Palestinians can do no wrong, and Israel can do no right. And it's as simple as that. And that's why even on a day like October 7th, you see people celebrating. I mean, I literally confronted people celebrating on the streets of London when I was there on October 8th, before any response by Israel. People were happy. And I would say there's quite specific demographics who were happy. But
here's the little joke at the end of it. I don't want to say joke. It's the irony. But we should savor this irony. What Said would say in his criticism of the Orientalists is that you don't know the Palestinians, you don't know the Arabs. They are just props for you in a particular drama that you want to tell that justifies the conquest of these lands. Well, I would argue, especially now that we have seen for the last week, very brave Palestinians in Gaza who are now calling on Hamas to leave and to return the hostages. Well, what does that tell us about the tenor and the agenda of the activism since October 7th? Because that activism has just presupposed that the people of Gaza are represented by Hamas, and that the horrific pogrom of October 7th is an expression of legitimate rage, and that's the way to understand it. Mm-hmm. Well, now we're seeing lots of Palestinians saying, no, not in our name. So,
and they're being killed for it.
And they're being killed for it too. It's horribly tortured. Yes. But what I'm saying is that, well, it seems like in that respect, the Palestinians are just props in your own drama about American empire. So in a strange way, the children and grandchildren, intellectual children and grandchildren of Said are Orientalists in a sense themselves, because they do not view the subjects. They view the subjects of the Palestinians as objects or props in their own particular kind of, drama about what they want, what they're interested in, which they call American empire or Zionism or something like that. But they're not seeing the Palestinians as fully human at this point either, because if they did see them as fully human, they would recognize off the bat that even if you didn't have any sympathy for the victims of October 7th, the Jews and also foreign workers and Druze and other folks, what a terrible thing to do to the people of Gaza. which is to foist upon them a war that they had no agency in voting for, supporting, or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? You would actually understand that the Palestinians are, you could argue, doubly victimized. They're victimized by the Israeli bombardment, sure, but they're also victimized by the war plan of Hamas. They're victimized by this, terrorist but also tyrannical group that rules Gaza with an iron fist and drags these people into war, doesn't let them leave zones that the Israelis are going to saying that they're about to bomb. And we never saw that. There was no recognition of that kind of humanity from the people who claim to be representing the Palestinians after October 7th in the West. So in that respect, they are guilty, in my view, of the same kind of categorical errors that Said sort of would point out about what he would call the Orientalists.
If I can hone in a couple of the fault lines around Columbia University, I appreciate the conversations going here and there, but you have written against, or critical, I should say, the detainment of Mahmoud Khalil by ICE. Mahmoud Khalil, it's different charges or different accusations at different times. Originally, Tom Homan, the border czar, said one thing. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said something else. And now I believe the latest charge is that he lied on his application form to come to the US in the first place. It seems to me, so this fella, Khalil, he was a chief negotiator on the behalf of Columbia University Apartheid Divest. He, as far as I can see, I didn't find anything that he said that's anti-Semitic. I couldn't find anything beyond what was nothing explicit. Now, I might be wrong about that, but what I did find was that the CUAD, through particularly their Substack, have absolutely been pro-Hamas, pro-Hezbollah, pro-Houthi, pro-Nasrallah. It's unapologetically on that side of things. And he was a representative of them, and I went through the legal stuff, and it seems like legally the state's not going to have a problem deporting him, as far as I can tell. But maybe you challenge me on that. But it's clearly the case that this is against the spirit of free speech. Now, it's not to say that they're not legally allowed to do what they want, but it does seem to me that this is against the spirit of free speech. Not to say I don't support the deporting of him. What's your position on it?
Well, my position is, first of all, I believe the First Amendment is the law of the land in America. It is not simply a privilege of American citizens. So that's the first point. So I don't think you can deport people for just their speech. It has happened in American history. And it's happened to people who probably deserve to be reported. I'm thinking of Emmett Goldman. But on the other hand, I do think it's an important sort of line that in America, you do not get arrested. You do not get, you don't get punished by the state for something you say. If there's evidence that Khalil lied on his visa forms or his green card application, then yes, people get deported for that all the time. I am asking mainly to prove it and give that, and he is due his process. So that's the first point, which is the government says something. We have a system in this country where we don't just take their word on it, and that's the first point. The second point is that the law that they were initially invoking, and I believe they still invoke for a number of their, Rubio has said there's been 300 examples of students that he has, he is trying to deport, is, I think, a very bad law that I hope the Supreme Court strikes down. It's the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act. And that law says that any individual who's here on a visa or here as a permanent resident that the Secretary of State determines undermines or, somehow challenges American foreign policy, can deport without due process. Now, that has never really been challenged for those reasons. There have been a couple examples of using that law in its history, but never for something that's simply a matter of speech. So it would be like, I think there was a former Mexican finance minister who was in America who was involved on corruption charges, and there were much more solid reasons, not about what he said.
If I may, there's actually a lot of examples of that law being used. Under Biden alone, there are reports that he deported over 80 Chinese nationals without giving reasons, including...
But not for their speech.
Not for their speech. You're right.
That's my argument is only on the speech. My argument is...
Sure, but the law is that they don't. It's nothing to do with speech. It's that if the Secretary of State believes it's a threat to American foreign policy,
right,
he doesn't have to give a reason. It's just he has to believe
I
it.
understand that, but I'm saying if the reason that you're saying is a threat to foreign policy is because of something they wrote or an op-ed or something like that, well, that is a violation of free speech. That is, and so to me, I would like to see that challenged. So yes, you have the right to do it, but like you could also argue that there was a law in the books. I wrote this in a piece a week ago, that there was a law in the books called the Logan Act, which said no private citizen can make foreign policy standing in for the United States. Well, okay, so technically Mike Flynn in the transition between the Obama and Trump presidencies in 2016 and 2017 had meetings with the Russian ambassador. But that happens all the time in presidential transitions. He was the incoming national security advisor. Of course he was having those meetings. So yes, you can find a law and you can, say, aha, there's a violation. I'm going to start an investigation. But to me, that's politicizing the law and it's wrong. Then there's a sort of broader principle for me, and that is that I am not worried or afraid of just the expression of pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel sentiment. That's what to really believe in free speech is to believe that the antidote to speech that you find objectionable is better speech. Mm-hmm. And I think we all would agree with that. Now, in that respect, again, if you want to deport people because you've shown that they have a direct connection to a terrorist group, they have provided material support for a terrorist group, they've engaged in vandalism, they have harassed or intimidated, students, those are all non-speech issues. Speech does not protect you from harassing people. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? So it's like but my issue is if the reason that you're saying is he said something, I think that undermines my foreign policy, he's out, that is a very bad precedent in my view. Because let's say there's a Democratic president. Okay, let's say that it's the U.S. foreign policy to support gender transition surgery for minors all over the world, and we're going to have USAID programs. God forbid, I would hate that world. Okay, let's say that's the case. Should they be able to deport somebody, who's here on a green card, who wants to be an American citizen, who decides to write or speak about their concerns about youth gender medicine? I mean, it's such a powerful weapon in the hands of a Secretary of State, and that I just don't want to see this precedent being set.
Okay, so my argument against it, what your argument would be more on the lines of national sovereignty.
Sure.
So the principles, I follow your principles there. But if you remove the law, if you remove the ability for America to remove people from its nation at its own will, then in a sense, you have lost control of your borders. Like that is quite a mighty thing to give up.
I think the problem that needs to be addressed is who you're let in. So I have no problem by saying we're going to really focus up on people that we're letting in to give them student visas to see if they are coming from, a tradition or they have a history of supporting Hamas or something like that. That's totally fine to say we're not going to let you in the country.
Yes, which Biden did with Israelis. And
did he do that with Israelis?
He did it with some
settlers. Okay, I think he sanctioned settlers or something like that.
He also revoked some visas of settlers.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's So, in my view, if you want to have tighter enforcement and not let people into universities who are going to be these rabble rousers and make Jewish students feel like they have to hide their identity or something like that, that's fine. That is, I think, on your point about sovereignty, but particularly for someone who has a green card, and particularly because people who have a green card are permanent legal residents of the United States, I believe that you have to sort of accept that they can say what they enjoy free speech rights, and that
I don't think Mahmoud Khalil was a permanent resident.
No, he was. He had a green card.
He was. He had a green card.
He had a green card. Now, I mean,
he wasn't a citizen. That's right.
He wasn't a citizen.
He's a resident, but not a citizen. Excuse my mistake.
Right. Yeah. Okay. It's a little trickier, I think, for someone who's just on a student visa. And again, if the new line from the administration is, we're going to prove that he lied on his applications, and that very may be the case, and people get deported all the time for lying on their applications. That seems to me it's not. Then it's out of the realm of a threat to free speech.
The thing about that, though, is that I think you suggested this earlier, is that you're probably able to remove anyone on those terms because you could probably find something that's not exactly accurate on any individual.
Well, you'd have to show that you're not sort of just simply focusing on one set versus another. But in my view, that takes it out of the realm that I am worried about. What I'm worried about is, like this woman, I think her name is, oh God, I'm not going to remember, but she's a Tufts University graduate student. She wrote an op-ed. She co-wrote an op-ed, fairly mild op-ed, disagreed with it, but fine. And if that's the only evidence against her, and she's now in some, holding pen in Louisiana and was taken off the streets, I just don't think I think that is its own kind of violation of the free speech in this country, and I don't like it. Again, I want it to be it can't just be that you express support for Hamas, as loathsome an idea as that is. It has to be that you did something that I would, that is out of that free speech realm. Again, like if you were involved in organizing the takeover of Hamilton Hall at Columbia, and what was sort of the brief detention of that poor janitor who we saw, a year ago.
Remind me of that story.
Well, when they took over Hamilton Hall, there was a janitor who was still in Hamilton Hall,
yeah.
and he was in a physical confrontation. There's a famous photo of him, and they wouldn't let him leave.
This is students. It's not the CUAD. It's just
that's the CUAD. I mean, it was, and interestingly enough, this is the other part of this. The CUAD was working with groups of people who weren't Columbia students, that were part of just sort of the activists of New York City. Some of them were involved with something called the People's Forum. And they would come into Columbia and they would bolster their numbers, and they were part of the takeover of Hamilton Hall. So there's a lot of things where they're not all students. Some of these people are also in their late 30s and 40s and so forth, who were engaged in this kind of thing. That's fine. And the problem, of course, is that the district attorney of Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, doesn't like really enforcing most crime. But again, if the grounds for kicking out Khalil were that you really got him on this stuff, great. I don't have a problem with it. I'm not defending.
The problem is that there's not actually evidence of that.
Well, maybe there is, but they haven't presented it yet. My issue is it's not even with is there or isn't there. We may learn that there's a lot of bad stuff that Khalil did, and if it comes out, okay.
Yeah.
The point is that that's not what the government said when they initially detained him. The argument was, well, he was involved with this group.
Yeah.
I mean, and then that's like a guilt by association. There's all kinds of things. And he didn't, and they also were arguing that he didn't deserve due process. I believe a permanent resident deserves due process, and you can't say the reason you're kicking out or he's undermining U.S. foreign policy is because he said certain things. That to me right there is just a huge red flag. And I just think we saw such violations of the spirit of free speech from Democrats and other liberals in Europe in the last 4 years, particularly since COVID. And you were on the front lines of this, so you know that it's like to start off the Trump administration with this kind of thing. I feel it sets us back. It's just another example of free speech for me, but not for thee. And that the reason why I believe so much in these values is because I believe they protect the people whose speech I loathe the most. And that we have to, and that's the only way forward. Because I just don't trust it. And listen, I don't think Republicans are going to run America for the next, for the next 1,000 years. Saying I think that you're going to get a Democrat, and I want the rules to restrain the Democrats just as much as I want the rules to restrain the Republicans.
Yeah. There's another sort of sticky topic pertaining to Columbia University, and I think it ultimately goes down to the definition of anti-Semitism, but President Trump said he would withhold the federal funding to the Columbia University to the tune of $400 million. I'm not sure exactly what the latest is as we speak now, but he was saying that it was because the university had failed to uphold the Civil Rights Act, and that Jewish students were being unfairly treated because of their race. I guess there's the question that this kind of, it's definitely the case that I've seen videos of this, that students were beaten and rocks were thrown at them because they were Jewish or because they were pro-Israel. But the thing I think that's the the stickier aspect is the definition of anti-Semitism, which, depending who you ask, there are different definitions of this, and I would love it for you to put me up to date with what's the latest, because I believe in 2024 there was a bill led by Republicans to have a codified definition of anti-Semitism. Now, some of these definitions include criticism of Israel, which I would say that shouldn't be included in any definition of anti-Semitism.
I think I have to. It's not just criticism of Israel. Of course, you should be able to criticize Israel. You should be able to criticize any government in the world. That's not the point. The point is that when your criticism of Israel, first of all, equates it with Nazi Germany, I think that does kind of get into the realm of anti-Semitism. And second of all, it is when you hold Israel to an impossible double standard that you would not hold other countries to, because it is a very specific, it's a different kind of country. It is the safe haven of all the Jewish people. It's the only Jewish state in the world. And it's when the tenor of the criticism of Israel is such that you're holding it to an impossible kind of standard. Now, I am uncomfortable with, because I'm a free speech absolutist, I think you have a right as an American to say anti-Semitic things as much as I find those things to be abhorrent. I would have been with the ACLU at the Nazi March in Skokie, even though I find that the Nazi March in Skokie, where a lot of survivors of the Holocaust lived, is abhorrent. So my argument here is a little different, I think, than some, because I don't want Jewish people in America to just sort of say, well, there are all these new rules to protect minorities from feeling uncomfortable or feeling, their words feel like violence or something like that. And I do think that there is a double standard on university campuses, which is the only group you're allowed to criticize in such a way. The only group of students you're allowed to make feel incredibly uncomfortable are Jews. You could never get away with that if you said something about transgender people or blacks or Muslims or other groups. So that's a fair point, that if you're going to have the rules, then why is my group not being protected? But I actually would rather look at it a different way. I would say we should stop being in the business of saying that people who are made to feel uncomfortable by speech have a right to regulate that speech. College campuses are supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. And again, the best antidote, in my view, to speech that you abhor is better speech. And that is a principle that's very hard sometimes to stick to. So again, I'm somewhat uncomfortable by the tenor of the conversation. On the other hand, I will say this. The United States, when it gives money to any institution, whether it's a university or whoever, they have all kinds of criteria for like, well, all right, you get the money, but you have to do these following things. That happens all the time. Under Democratic administrations, there were all kinds of conditions for receiving money, including, like how you dealt with sexual harassment cases on campus. And there were guidelines that were then sent by the federal government, and nobody complained, oh my God, this is a violation of academic freedom and academic integrity, because that at the time, that was going in the direction of the left. So it's hard for me to shed a tear right now for Columbia, who now finds, its Middle East Studies department put into the equivalent of academic receivership. But on the other hand,
is that right?
Yes, that's part of the agreement that the Trump administration laid down, and that the interim president had agreed to.
Oh wow!
Yeah, although it's unclear what's going to happen with all of that, because we had a great story from our Maya Solkin about how the interim president also told the faculty in a separate meeting that kind of week.
Who's Maya Solkin?
She's a reporter at the Free Press.
Okay.
She's a very good one. And she's got this great scoop, which was that she told the faculty, oh, no, we're not going to do all this. You know what I mean? We just told this to the Trump administration. So it sort of puts them in a little bit of a hot seat. But the point is that this kind of thing happens. You get $400 million from the federal government. Yeah, there's going to be some strings attached.
Yeah.
And so these are different strings. And I really don't have a problem with it, because I guess I could say, I think that these departments at Columbia have just been so out of whack, and have become so much kind of leaned in one ideological hard direction for so long, that I don't mind this kind of pressure. I don't see this as the same kind of issue as I do with the legal justification for deporting Khalil. Mm. But at the same time, and I hate to do this, because I know I'm not trying to. I'm just saying I have a bit of a nuanced view. At the same time, my hope as a Jewish person is that the Jewish people can sort of see beyond, like, I don't want to just be included in the hierarchy of the oppressed. I want to kind of get beyond what is a very toxic way to look at free speech on campus, where we have to be, I think it's fine to make the argument. You should be sensitive to be a good person, and, it's good manners.
Mm.
But if you want to say something that offends somebody, that's the nature of life in the big city, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and the way to deal with that is, okay, write an op-ed for the student newspaper, this is how it works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess last topic I wanted to get into is you had a huge piece on Qatar a couple of years ago. And you revealed all of this links to our conversation about lobbying.
Yeah.
You've revealed all of their influence in America. Now, I wanted to bring up Qatar again for a couple of reasons and to see where you are on it now. But firstly, of course, Qatar has been a place hosting negotiations between Hamas and Israel throughout the war. And they have an American military base there.
Yes.
You have suggested earlier, and I would happily assert, that I see them as part of the axis of evil, which is the Qataris, Iran, Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, and I see it not as the allies, unlike the sort of, let's say, the Abraham Accord group in the Middle East. Another reason is that Tucker Carlson recently did an interview there. And as far as I've understood it, that interview itself was sponsored by the Qatari state. And I wanted to get an understanding of is Qatar really a neutral place for Israel and Hamas to be doing this?
No.
There's reports that Hamas have been able to siphon off billions of dollars, or the leadership of Hamas, and keep it safely in Qatar for themselves. And yet, again, the American airbase is there. How do I make sense of this?
Okay, well, we got to go back and put a little context. After 9/11, we found out that there were lots of prominent Saudi families that were raising money, giving money to effectively what was Al-Qaeda. They were charities that ended up being kind of effectively controlled by Al-Qaeda. There was a huge problem among our allies in the Middle East, UK and the US, where they were sort of playing a double game. Yes, they were our allies, they sold us oil, they did all these sorts of things, but they also exported radical Islam. And it was a huge problem. And American foreign policy, European foreign policy, for a good long while, like I would say the first 10 years after 9/11, worked on bringing Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other countries around to the idea that actually by exporting radical Islam, you were only, you're feeding the crocodile that will eventually eat you. They hate you too. And it worked for almost all of the Gulf states, except for one, Qatar. Qatar did not want to give up on radical Islam. They didn't want to give up on the Muslim Brotherhood. And this caused a huge diplomatic crisis during the first Trump term in 2017, 2018. If you remember, there was like effectively a kind of Gulf state, in all the other Gulf states embargoed Qatar for about 1.5 to 2 years. And this was a huge problem, because the Qataris just did not want to give it up. They were basically placing their bets on Iran, which is Shia, but they were placing their bets on fundamentalist Islam. Fast forward to October 7th, 2023, the first statements out of the Qatari government's house, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, were to praise October 7th as a kind of act of resistance. I forget the exact quote, but it's out there, but you can see it.
Wow.
That was how they responded to October 7th. So, of course, they are not just neutral, but it gets more complicated. Because if we're being completely honest, it's not just the Qataris, but like spread a ton of money in American universities and throughout the United States. They've also, at least, they have kind of worked with the Israeli government to fund in cash Hamas, basically, in Gaza. So that's a policy that the Israelis knew about. Also, I should say the Americans knew about it. And it really started after the 2014 to 2015 war. and somebody had to rebuild Gaza, and it was determined that the Qataris could do that. So they kind of had a pass to fund Hamas in Gaza. That was a terrible policy. And, I think that the Israeli public will at some point punish the, Netanyahu and other Israeli politicians that allowed that to happen. But now we are seeing, the question has to be at this point, are you going to continue to allow Qatar to play both sides? And I would hope that there would be some clarity on this question. But so far from the Trump administration, it's been muddled at best, because the Qataris have been praised by Steve Witkoff, who is sort of the shadow Secretary of State and the chief negotiator.
He has praised them?
Yes, he has.
For what?
For being, terrific during the negotiations and so forth, and so generous with their diplomatic offices.
I see. And they have also been involved in the Arab League plan to rebuild Gaza.
Yes.
This, to the tune of $53 billion, I believe, is the Arab countries have agreed on. And I wonder if we, on that note, and as we sort of tie this together, think about the future of this conflict. And I appreciate we've gone from what's going on in America to what's going on in Israel, back and forth. But the ceasefire failed at the phase 2 and has been resumed. Both sides have qualms and reasons to point the finger at the other, or at least they are pointing the finger at the other. What are your hopes or predictions, or how do you think this is panning out, and what can we predict Trump's influence on peace resolution? He's keen to have it clean up and end the whole thing. What do you see as the current situation and how we can see things going forward?
Well, it's too soon to say what's going to happen with the what appears to be the organic uprising in Gaza against Hamas. But that's the path out of this. So you have to have Palestinians rejecting Hamas. And we have to kind of view them as our best chance for peace at this point. Because if Hamas is able to retain some kind of control of Gaza, which is not tolerable for Israel, but if that happens, then that is a guarantee that you're going to have war in the future, and that you will not have the kind of development, and you will not have the steps that will ultimately lead, I hope, that everybody wants, is a two-state solution where we can finally put this conflict to an end.
You still believe in a two-state solution?
Yes, I do. Well, I mean, I don't believe we're close to it, but I would rather a two-state solution at this point.
Really?
Yes.
That makes you quite an outlier, because I would say most pro-Israel, whether they're Israeli or non-Israeli, kind of given up on the idea of a two-state solution ever since October 7th.
Well, I would say that there is no two-state solution possible with current Palestinian leadership, but at some point I would like there to be a two-state solution. And my hope is that you will have another generation of sensible leaders that will come in to power. And I'm not saying that we're going to find them in this particular movement, but if you have Palestinians rejecting Hamas and the latest stuff that I've seen, I follow this very closely, is that they're calling to release the hostages. They want to end the war. That to me is there's a chance at that point that you can maybe have a Palestinian leadership that will not use its resources to make war against Israel, to build the, Gaza underground metro, the tunnels, and stockpile weapons and launch wars every couple of years. And instead, and try to take hostages. And instead, what you will have is a leadership that's interested in doing the hard work of building a Palestinian state that can live side by side with Israel. I think if you put it like that, most Israelis would agree. It's just, I think that everybody understands that you can't do that right now with the leadership of Hamas, and you certainly can't do it also, sadly, with, the desiccated leadership of Mahmoud Abbas and what's left of the Palestinian Authority. So there has to be a new generation of leaders to come in. But I don't think I don't think it's good for Israel to just sort of permanently occupy, land where 4 or 5 million Palestinians live. That's not a good outcome. Yeah. It would be nice if they could have their own country, and there would be some sort of Benelux arrangement maybe with Israel and the Palestinians and Jordan and so forth, and there could be prosperity.
Yeah. I was given tremendous hope by the Abraham Accords, which I've already mentioned. But
Yeah.
what I haven't fully understood is whether we can expect the Abraham Accords to come back. It doesn't seem like Jared Kushner, who really led the negotiations, is coming back into politics. Or
But I think the Saudi deal is cooked. I think the Saudis want that with Israel.
They
the
do.
Israelis want it with Saudi. I just think it's about the timing at this point.
So the conflict in Gaza needs to end.
Yeah, I think it complicates it. But I also think that the Saudis understand they're much better off having an alliance with Israel than submission to Iran. Like, Iran wants to conquer the region. Israel just wants to live. And that right there is why that's the underlying logic. Now, Kushner deserves an enormous amount of credit, but I know this because I covered him closely in Washington when before these accords were signed. People thought it was crazy. He took a different approach. He deserves an enormous amount of credit. But the reason that he was able to do it is because it's apparent to everybody that, Iran is a fanatic revolutionary regime and nobody trusts them. Whereas Israel has survived long enough that it's like, I don't think that the Saudis think that, the Jews want to take over Mecca. So
we need to see a resolution of the conflict before.
I think probably that's the case. I also think that, there's already quiet in the shadows alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia. They share intelligence. They're on the same side when it comes to Iran. That's Israel's existential threat. So I think there's already the groundwork is there.
Okay. Well, Eli, it's been a broad,
wonderful,
wide-scoped
great
conversation.
Thank
you so much. You mentioned your new podcast, Breaking History.
I want to mention it again, Breaking History. Please subscribe. I think your listeners will love it. These are like audio documentaries, and I pick a topic, usually in the news, and I explain an event, an episode in history that kind of maybe illuminates what we're seeing right now.
So you've done Edward Said. Well, that's up next. But who else have you done?
Well, we did one that compared Luigi Mangione to Ulrike Meinhof, who was the most notorious terrorist in West German history. One of my favorites that we did was a look at the groundbreaking 1975 mayoral election in San Francisco to explain the roots of the rot in the Democratic Party of California. Our first one was about populism and Donald Trump's rise, looking at it from the lens of the first populist president in American history, Andrew Jackson. So there's a lot of really good stuff. And then we have a whole archive of episodes that are very similar that are basically the same kind of Breaking History that we did, that I did for Honestly. So that if you go to the Breaking History show on Spotify or Apple or at the Free Press, you'll find, I think, a back catalog now of 12 or 13.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Eli, a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We must
It was great.
do it again.
We will do it again. I would love it.
Thanks for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Eli Lake. Remember, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Eli Lake exploring the issues you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. But until next time, be well.